Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have a great evening ahead of us. My name is Isabella Fisk. I am one of the co-chairs of the Holocaust Council of Greater Metro West. Excuse me. My other co-chair, Susie Brock, is unfortunately not feeling so well tonight, so she cannot be with us. So we hope she's starting to feel better. But so I am excited to have this opportunity to kick off this inaugural event of the 2G, 3G We Do event. And thank you to Elise Wolf in advance for being our speaker tonight and telling us all the wonderful things about your family. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. For those of you that don't know me, I am a second-generation Holocaust survivor. My father, Mark Schoenwetter, is a Holocaust survivor. And we go around and speak at many places and tell his story. He is thankfully still with us, knock on wood. I am very blessed and honored to have him with us and for a lot of people to hear his story. And I know as well as all of you guys know, I am always proud to say I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, because it is something that is something we all share together, and we can really, truly look up to our parents and our grandparents for the things that they went through and the atrocities that they lived through. And I'm proud to continue to tell my father's story. So Greater Metro West is proud to be involved in this opportunity to be able to educate through New Jersey and through the country to pass along our generational stories. And without further ado, because I know it's going to be a long, exciting night of hearing from everybody and learning some new stuff, I want to introduce Elise Shane-Brown, the Director of Holocaust Education of Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabella, and thank you for joining us tonight. A few housekeeping things before we start. I know we had a little bit of a technical glitch. If you look on your box on the screen and it says Stacy Pinellas, please click on the 3 dots on the right and hit rename, and rename yourself to your name, please. So I see a few of you that are like that. The second thing is that we just need to know for registration what your names are, and we want to get to know each other and see who everyone is. The second thing is, if you can put your camera on, we would have loved to have this kickoff event in person, and we are hoping our next one will be. But for now, we'd love to be able to see everyone, because we do want this to be a growing, intimate group. So if it's possible for you to put your cameras on, please do so. So those are just a few housekeeping things before we get started. Going on. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Elise Shane-Brown. I'm the Director of Holocaust Education for the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. I often tell people that despite my role and what I do in the fields I went into professionally, I am not a second or third generation of Holocaust survivors. And with my close working and personal relationship with Isabella, we both really do honor that of each other, that we share this passion despite that we come from different areas of thought and why we come to this. And it is truly special and an honor for me to be with all of you tonight. As we get further and further away from the Holocaust, we know and understand that we're going to need other people to tell the stories besides survivors. And while we know it's going to be in a very long time, because these survivors just keep going, and which is amazing, we do know that one day we are going to need you to carry on the legacies of your families. And that's why we have worked tirelessly for the past 2 years to kick off this new program of incorporating second and third generations, and even at some point fourth generations, since we know many of them are reaching adulthood as well, fourth generations, to continue to tell the stories of their parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents. I got a few questions while we were doing this about what defines a first generation, second generation, third generation, where people come from. Does somewhat delegate where you thought your naming would be. So here in the world of Holocaust education in the United States, in conjunction with also Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum, we don't really have the term first generation. That really is what we use for immigrants to this country. We have survivors. So if you were the survivor, your name is survivor. You would be the survivor. If your parents were survivors, you would be considered a second generation. And if your grandparents, you would be a third generation. And in some cases, you might be both, because you might have a parent and a grandparent, or depending on what side it's from or where it comes from, you could delegate as both. So I'm going to go under the assumption that nobody has the mistake of being a first generation here, because that would make you the survivor, which we love and adore, but this was not the avenue for them tonight, and that everybody else would be of subsequent generations. So as we learned tonight, I invited a dear colleague and friend of mine, Elise Wolf, to join us to share her story as the granddaughter of survivors, but also to share her journey in telling her story and how impactful it has been for her to learn the backgrounds, put the presentation together, and be able to share with children, adults, all different kinds of communities across the state and further, in order to educate on what happened to her family during the Holocaust. So Elise is a third generation. She is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. She began 3G New Jersey, which we are so fortunate to continue to start this wonderful partnership. And she also is a state commissioner on the New Jersey State Commission on Holocaust Education. So with that, we welcome Elise to share her story, and we are going, like we said, going to keep this informal. So if you come up with a question while she's speaking, please put it in the chat. And at the end, we will ask questions and moderate a conversation. And if there's anything that anyone wants to share with me or with us as a whole, we are always here to do that. And so with that, Elise, welcome.
Thank you, Elise. And as we said before, it's not always usual to have two Elises in the room. So it's funny, always sounding like I'm thanking myself. I'm going to share my screen. And as I do, as Elise mentioned, is it working? Let's see. Can I just get like a thumbs up from someone if it's working so I know you can see it? Great. So as Elise mentioned, I am a 3G. Both of my grandparents on my mother's side were Holocaust survivors. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about my grandfather's story because, like many survivors, he didn't speak about his experience and he passed away long before I was born. So today I will be focusing on my grandmother's story of survival, but of course my grandfather will also play a role. As was mentioned, I not only am a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, but I am a co-founder and co-chair of 3GNJ, and I also sit on the New Jersey State Commission on Holocaust Education. Knowing that I was the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor has always had a great impact on my life, but it wasn't until about 6-7 years ago, when the last survivor in my family died, that I realized that it's up to me and my generation and future generations to keep their stories alive. It was when I came to this realization that I became much more involved in Holocaust education, the commission, and 3G. The co-founders of 3GNJ, including Michelle Edgar, who's here tonight, and another friend of ours, Jessica Wang, got together about 3 years ago and found that we really had this connection where we felt this need to continue our grandparents' stories. So we formed this group, 3GNJ, and we have since joined forces with 3GNY, 3GDC, and 3G Philly. We basically have a whole nice East Coast thing going on. Prior to COVID, we held many large in-person programs with survivors and also some smaller programs where we talked about life as 3Gs and having parents who are 2Gs. And through 3GNY, 3GNJ has since offered the We Do program, which stands for We Educate, where we learn to share our grandparents' stories in an impactful way to students and others in an attempt to fill the void that's being left by survivors who spoke publicly at schools and for other organizations. For 4 weeks, we worked closely with Peter Nelson, the founder and executive director of Facing History and Ourselves, a New York-based initiative that provides training to teachers and students to stand up to hate and bigotry by facing our collective history and deciphering how it informs our attitudes and behaviors. I certainly don't know all of my grandmother's story. And as I'll get into in a little bit, she only told her story publicly once, which was to my 8th grade class the year before she died. She never shared her full story with my mom or my aunt. In fact, they never even wanted to ask her about her story or what she went through because they didn't want to upset her. And this is a little bit of the difference in the dynamic that's usually found between 2Gs and 3Gs. Because as a 3G, I saw the numbers on my grandmother's arm and I said, "What are those numbers?" And she said, "The bad people put it there." And at the time, that was enough. But as I got older, I asked more questions. So the story I'm sharing to you tonight is what I have weaved together based on what I know of her story. Unlike the presentation I would normally give to students or others in attendance, where I have built-in questions, I'm going to stop at different points and let you know, here I would ask this question. I'm not going to ask you if you've ever heard of Auschwitz or if you know what a ghetto is, because I think all of us here are here because we know what those things are, unfortunately. So, I'll stop at different points and explain a few things along the way, and also explain why I specifically word things the way that I do to show you how important the We Do program is and how much I got out of it. So with that, I'd like to introduce you, and I will tell you, I get emotional every single time I tell my grandmother's story. So it's just part of who I am. So I'd like to introduce you to my grandmother, my Anyu, which means mother in Hungarian. Her name is Jolan Moldovan Lichman. And when I think of her smile, the smell of her baking, dancing with her at my bat mitzvah, but also about the horrors that she endured. I call her my Anyu, but everybody who knew her called her Anyu because she was the mother to everybody she met. This is the last picture we ever took together in the end of 1993 before she came down with cancer, and she died in May of 1994 when I was only 14. I wish I had more time with her because I have so many questions that are unanswered. As I mentioned, she only spoke publicly once, and she never really shared her story with anybody until I started asking questions of her. This is actually a picture that I took, a screenshot from when my dad recorded her speaking to my 8th grade class on a giant video camera in 1993 that sat on his shoulder. And, when I was putting this presentation together, I really wanted to be able to share portions of the video, but the quality is just so awful that it's impossible. So I had it changed to a DVD and I listened to it over and over again and really helped to put my story together that I share. But I will say that some bits and pieces of my grandmother's story that she shared with my class didn't always make sense. So what I've put together here is a weaving together of what I can speak to with certainty, as opposed to playing a guessing game with her history. So my Anyu was born on August 31st, 1918 in Batis, a farming village in the Satu region of Romania near the Hungarian border. Batis was once part of Hungary, so my family spoke Hungarian even though they were Romanian. My grandmother was the 10th of 11 children born to Hana, who I'm named after, my middle name is Hana, and Vilmos Moldovan. My grandmother had so many nieces and nephews close in age to her. And this picture was actually taken before my grandmother was born. She's not pictured here. Her grandfather is in the middle with her parents on either side, and the first 8 children that they had are pictured here. My grandmother's mother passed away when my grandmother was only 9 years old, so she was mostly raised by her father and her older siblings. Batis was a farm country where my family grew their own food, raised their own animals, took their animals to the butcher when they were ready to eat, and they never had indoor plumbing. My grandmother only received a 3rd grade education. She used to walk to the city of Satu Mare, and I put city in quotes because it certainly wasn't a city, from Batis. And because she only had 1 pair of shoes, she would walk barefoot so as not to ruin her shoes on the walk. At some point along the way, and neither my mom nor my aunt really know exactly how, my grandmother met my grandfather, Joseph Lichtman. My grandmother was only 16 and he was 21, but the story is that it was love at first sight. My grandfather's mother did not approve of my grandmother because she was too poor, but nonetheless, my grandfather proposed in 1940, but they didn't marry until 1943 when after all of my grandmother's older sisters had been married off. The war was already underway, but not in Satumare. However, once the Germans invaded in March of 1994, the Romanians were very quick to join on with the hatred of the Jews. My grandmother talked about how she remembered hearing her friends and people who she thought were her friends and her neighbors sing songs about killing the Jews and how terrible the Jews are. She witnessed Jews being lined up and shot into the river. And even before she and my grandfather and the rest of my family were forced into the ghetto, my grandmother's father, who at the time was an elder member of the Jewish community, came home to her one day crying because the Germans had grabbed him in the middle of the town square and cut off his beard as a way to embarrass him. As my grandmother said, it was because he was Jewish. There was no other reason. In the spring of 1944, my grandparents and their entire families on both of their sides were brought to the Satumare ghetto. So here's where I would say to students, and it also really depends on who my audience is based on their Holocaust education and just general age. I would ask what a ghetto is. We might talk a little bit about minority groups and the difference between, different meanings of ghetto. But just want to give you a sense of how I try to engage the audience depending upon their knowledge. So my grandmother explained how she and my grandfather were rushed out of their home at gunpoint. And while some people were able to gather their belongings and bring it with them, she had nothing with her. She spent a couple of months in the ghetto before being deported to Auschwitz. Of course, I don't have pictures of my grandmother being deported to Auschwitz, but this picture that I found in one of the history books online really speaks to what she described. The Satumare ghetto was liquidated through 6 different transports between May and June of 1944. It's estimated that almost 19,000 Jews were sent from that ghetto alone to Auschwitz. My Anu described how 200 people were crammed into a cattle car with no food, no water, no bathroom, and no room to even sit down. As people died around her, they couldn't even fall to the ground because there was no room. She estimates that she was on the cattle car for 3 to 4 days on the 300-mile track from Satumare to Auschwitz. As I mentioned, my grandmother was the 10th of 11 children, and she happened to be deported with her sister, Irene, who she managed to stay with the whole time that she was in the camps. She talked about how when they arrived to Auschwitz, they saw the sign, the Arbeit, my German is terrible, so the Arbeit macht frei, which means work shall set you free. And here is another point where I usually stop and talk to students about how the B in the sign is actually upside down. And there's a couple of different theories as to why the B is upside down. The first is a sign of resistance by the Jews who were forced to create the sign. And the other is to show that something is not right here. My Anu spoke about the selection process when they came off the train car, how she and everybody else were forced off at gunpoint and people were sent to the left or to the right. One group full of children and mothers and fathers were sent to a shower, never to be seen again. As a newlywed, my grandmother was actually newly pregnant when she arrived at the camp. Thankfully, she was not yet showing. She claims that Dr. Mengele was walking around on the day that she arrived and asked for all pregnant women to follow him. She took a step and started to walk towards him and then realized she would be separated from her sister, Irene. She took the step back and stayed in line, likely escaping death or worse. My grandmother also talked about how her arm was tattooed, and the tattoo was the first thing I ever noticed about her arm, and the first experience I had learning about the Holocaust. She described how every single needle prick hurt her so much, especially knowing that another Jew was being forced to tattoo her. Her number was A13143. And a little bit about the numbering system for those who don't know is that with the influx of Hungarian Jews in mid-1944, the Nazis introduced a new sequence of numbers starting with the A series to avoid the initial numbering series going too high and perhaps being found out about how many Jews and how many prisoners they had in the camp. The A series ended up at 20,000, and then the B series was started. This means my grandmother was the 13,143rd prisoner in the A series, with thousands before her and thousands after her. She talked about how she and Irene and the other prisoners were forced to get naked in front of men they had never known. And for an Orthodox Jewish woman, that's not only embarrassing, but it's totally stripping her of her dignity. She talked about how her hair was shaved, and not just the hair on her head, every single hair on her body, and that every belonging that she had with her was taken from her, which wasn't much because she didn't come with anything except for the clothes on her back. So again, I would not have a picture of my grandmother, but I share this picture because the confusion and embarrassment and just total lack of understanding is clear in these women's faces, not knowing how they got here or what was going to happen next. My grandmother talked about how they were first brought to a big barrack, and it was just a big room that had nothing in it. She said there were probably 2,000 people in that room with literally nothing, all starving, all shaved, and all humiliated. Women who still had their children with them, and then the children were taken away. Those women literally went crazy in front of my grandmother and ended up being killed. As my Anu said, you've learned very quickly how to behave in Auschwitz. She then was moved to a different type of barrack that had a bed. And by beds, I don't mean a comfy, cozy bed at home. I mean a shelf, a wooden shelf with some slats, no pillow, and blankets made of who knows what. Again, not a picture of my grandmother, but this very much depicts what she described to me. My grandmother talked about the 3 a.m. roll call, or the roll call or lineup that happened all times in the middle of the night. My grandmother explained how every single day she and the other prisoners were forced to line up, and they were counted for hours at a time. They were wasting away no matter what the weather in thin prisoner clothes. And every day she and the other women in the barrack would wake up, and each day they'd find dead bodies around them that they would have to carry outside to the count. Because if one person was missing from the count started over, and the prisoners were forced to stand out there until the count was completed. I'm going to share these two pictures of my Anu with you as I share a couple of stories with you that she had shared with my class and with me. She talked about how the SS guards would push and shove and whip the prisoners, sometimes for no reason at all. And one time my grandmother was whipped so hard that she couldn't sit down for 2 weeks. She talked about how hungry she and the other prisoners were, and that one day she and 2 other girls were so hungry that they decided to go on a search for some food that was perhaps in the garbage. They realized that they found a garbage with some food in it, and they grabbed the food. And as they were walking back to their barrack, an SS guard found them. 2 shots were fired, one in the leg of the woman to my grandmother's left, and one through the heart of the woman to my grandmother's right. Somehow she managed to get back to the barrack and was lucky to have survived and to have not been tortured for that. She had said that she said to my class that she felt that God must have looked away or perhaps abandoned her because she didn't understand how this could have happened to her, how she could have ended up in this camp. But then she also talked about how maybe it was an act of God that saved her life one day during a roll call. It was a rainy night, early morning, and all the prisoners were told to kneel because somebody was missing from the count. And while kneeling, as I mentioned before, my grandmother was pregnant. She had a miscarriage. The rain, the muddy grounds, and the women around her saved her life. She again escaped death, or worse, because an SS guard could have killed her, or she could have been tortured for lying and hiding her pregnancy. But because she had a miscarriage on that particular day, at that particular time, maybe it was a lack of nourishment, or maybe it was an act of God, she survived. My grandmother also talked about how, since the men and women were separated at Auschwitz, they would throw little pieces of wood back and forth over the fence that separated them. And one day, a woman came running to my grandmother with a little piece of wood, and my grandmother learned that my grandfather was on the other side of the fence. One other thing that amazed me when my grandmother told the story to my class was that she and other prisoners somehow kept track of time. She talked about Passover. She talked about Hanukkah. She talked about Rosh Hashanah. Somehow, despite the atrocities that were going on, and despite feeling that God maybe looked away, everything she referenced was around the Jewish holidays. As the US and Russian armies drew near, Nazis started to kill quickly in order to hide the evidence. My grandmother talked about the crematorium billowing smoke day and night for days. She talked about hearing of shootings in the courtyards that existed between the barracks. And she also talked about how sometime between the end of 1944 and 1945, before Auschwitz was liberated, she and my great aunt Irene were taken out of Auschwitz to a big factory to help with the German war efforts. She spent a couple of months there and remembers hearing bombings all around, and each time she and the other prisoners prayed that this was the end. Another place where I stop and talk a little bit is here to talk about death marches. So many prisoners were sent on death marches, and I, talked to the students if they, depending on their knowledge, if they've heard of it or what they know of it. And sometimes I'll add a little bit about my experience of going on the March of the Living in 1996, sorry. And the 3-kilometer march that I did from Auschwitz to Birkenau. But the reason I do this is because my Anu and Irene were sent on a death march from this factory near Auschwitz to Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt, or Terezin, was a very different kind of camp. It was used for propaganda by the Nazis and designed to hide the truly horrible conditions. At the beginning, it was self-run by prominent Jews, and they even had cultural events there. But of the 88,000 or so Jews that walked through the gates, few survived. They were either deported to death camps or died of starvation. But my Anu talked about how she and Irene walked for 3 weeks from Auschwitz to Terezin. They barely had any food on this walk other than what they were able to steal from the side of the road. And my great aunt was actually pretty sick at this point in time, so my grandmother had to pinch her cheeks to give her some color when the guards were walking around and checking on them, or she would have been left for dead. In fact, at points during the walk, my grandmother actually carried her sister on her back. She was in Terezin for a couple of weeks until she was liberated on May 9th, 1945 by the Russian army. So one of the things that I do with students as well is to show this slide, which shows that it was about 260 miles from Auschwitz to Terezin. And if you walked from Parsippany to Washington, D.C., you would not have walked as far as my grandmother had to walk barefoot, freezing, and starving with her sister on her back. My grandmother went back to Butties, where she was from, and with Irene, and she found that 3 of her brothers had survived. Her father had died, And when she spoke to my 8th grade class, she said that the one thing that she wished for, other than reuniting with my grandfather, was to have one more kiss from her father, and she never got it. 6 of her nieces and nephews also survived, but full lines of the family perished. Shortly after my grandmother returned, my grandfather also returned. We don't know much, as I mentioned, about his time, other than the fact that he spent some time in Dachau and Auschwitz and was liberated by the Americans who wanted him to go straight to America, but he refused until finding out whether or not my grandmother survived. My grandfather was the sole survivor from his immediate family. My grandmother and my grandfather took in one of my grandmother's nephews, Alan, who was the sole survivor from his immediate family. His mother was my grandmother's older sister. I knew him as Chuks, which was short for Bachuka, because when my mom was born and he was living with them, she at first thought he was her brother. And in Hungarian, Bachuka means brother. So somehow it got shortened to Chuks, and that's how I knew him my whole life. He was an important figure, and he passed away in 2016, and it was his death that really propelled me into getting more involved with Holocaust education and speaking publicly. And since my grandmother passed away in 1994, her story was not captured by the Shoah Foundation, but his story was. My grandfather wanted to go to America, but my Anu refused to leave her family. So they ultimately ended up staying in Batiz for a number of years. My aunt was born about 9 months after my grandparents reunited, and my mom 6 years later in 1952. In this picture, it's my grandfather sitting with my mom on his lap, my grandmother's arms around his neck, Chuks or Alan with his arms around my grandmother and my aunt, and 2 of my grandmother's nieces are also pictured here. When World War II ended, it wasn't as though all of a sudden people had compassion for the Jews. Anti-Semitism was still widespread, but in Satu Mare, life was okay. 2 of my grandmother's brothers ultimately went to Australia. One brother and Irene went, and children from another sister who had died went to Israel. My grandparents and my mom and my aunt and Chuksi left Romania in 1961 as communism was on the rise. They left with nothing, and they were heading to Israel. But my grandfather really wanted to see Paris. So they stopped in Paris, and my grandfather, this still amazes me. My grandfather heard of a cousin who survived, who moved to America. So he sent him a telegram from Paris, and that cousin said, "Why are you going to Israel? Come to America." So they did. And they ended up in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And this is a picture of my grandparents in front of the house that they ultimately bought in Perth Amboy. My grandfather worked as a mechanic and my Anu as a seamstress in a clothing factory. They built this life for themselves. They bought this house and they made a life for my mom and my aunt. My grandfather passed away 9 years after they immigrated when my mom was only 19. And as I mentioned, my Anu passed away in 1994 of cancer, an unimaginable horror after having suffered so much already. There's so much more that I wish I knew. I have so many unanswered questions because to think about what my grandmother went through is just truly, truly unbelievable. But despite the Nazi efforts, our family has grown. And in 2014, the Moldovan family, my grandmother's side of the family, met in Israel, and over 60 of us gathered and reunited. Sitting in the chairs on the left, 5 people in, is Alan Chuksi, and right to the side of him was his wife, Lily, who was also a survivor and actually a twin who lost her brother to Dr. Mengele because they were tested on. But this shows survivors, 2Gs, 3Gs, and 4Gs. I had one daughter in this picture and now I have 2. So I have 2 4Gs who know that they have a special history, but they're too young to really know the full story. So, you know, I share with you this story and I share with you my grandmother's resilience because we say never again. And we teach about the Holocaust to make sure that what our grandparents went through will never happen again to Jews or to anyone else. And as we see the rise in anti-Semitism in this area and around the world, it's a painful reminder that we still have a lot of work to do to stop anti-Semitism. So that's why I present this story to schools, and that's why I'm here tonight to explain the We Do program to you and share it with you, to answer questions that you may have, and also to encourage you 2Gs and 3Gs to get more involved. 3G and J, we'd be happy to share our programming with you. And we'll be partnering with Metro West in the future. So I appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoy is not the right word, but I hope you took something away from this story and you can, share it going forward.
Thank you so much for sharing and for listening and for being able to share with us the history and the story of your grandmother and ultimately your grandfather as well. I was so fortunate to hear it once before, and every time you tell it, it really passes on their legacy so beautifully. So thank you for sharing that with us.